Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on a very, very important topic, which is so globally relevant at this time of uncertainty. We are celebrating the International Day of Hope, and it's all about bringing hope, well-being to all parts of the globe. Before I go any further, let me acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I take this opportunity to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So we have a wonderful conversation lined up for you today. So without further ado, let me hand over to our wonderful director, Anna, to introduce our participant, Fiona, today.
Thanks, Benita. And with us today is Fiona Carter, who is a financial counsellor at Anglicare in the Northern Territory. And Fiona, thank you so much for your time today.
That's okay. I'm really, really feeling very happy about being invited to speak. So thank you.
Thank you. To start off with, it'd be great to understand your professional journey and what inspired your work at Anglicare Northern Territory. So if you can talk us through that journey and a little bit more about what you're currently doing, that would be great.
Yeah. So I actually began my professional career as a musician. I was a trumpeter. And then I went to the UK and studied cultural policy, and from there moved into arts management. And arts has been an amazing way for me to really invest in community, I think. So I've done a lot of work in community, a lot of collaborative work, and that work has taken me to the UK, to different parts of Asia, and brought me eventually to where I am now in the Northern Territory. And so I think I'm very much driven by my heart. I'm very passionate about what I do. And in the work I did, I started to really see that people needed help with finances. And I worked a lot with artists in different ways to help them work with money. And I found myself one day sort of wanting to expand that a little bit more. And I Googled helping people with money, and financial counsellor popped up. So I trained as a financial counsellor, and as you mentioned, I now work with Anglicare NT as a financial counsellor, but I also do still work in the arts as an independent producer. So I sort of cross over both spaces now.
Fantastic. And I guess when you were thinking about financial counseling, what sort of challenges did you see people struggling with when it came to managing their money?
Yeah, really the basics, if I'm honest. And I think it's really interesting. Money is something that we deal with every day in one way or another. It impacts very heavily on our lives, yet it's something that we are not really, well, certainly in Western society, encouraged to talk about. It's something that we are not really trained to deal with. Yet we're expected to be excellent financial managers, make good, sound money decisions, and expected to know what to do if things start going wrong. And from my experience as a financial counsellor, my experience just in generally working in the community, is that that's not the case. Yeah.
That makes sense. And it's something that comes with consequences as well. If you are expected to be able to manage money, you get credit for the first time and and you're using it, not necessarily knowing the impact of that or how that can impact you in the future, can have these consequences purely based on people just not actually knowing, which seems really avoidable, but can be hard to address.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. I mean, how do you know if you're making good decisions if you've never been taught what a good decision or a bad decision is, or what the consequences are of your decisions? And that doesn't. And I think money. Well, I know money carries a lot of stigma. It carries a lot of shame. We live in a world full of scams. We live in a world where we celebrate the rich. I mean, I was talking to my mum the other day. My mum's 96, and she said she's really had enough of watching the news where we seem to be celebrating a few extremely rich people, but we're missing, what the reality is in the world and how people really live and what the impact is of celebrating the really rich. Yeah.
That's a great point. And it's something that we don't even necessarily realize we're doing sometimes. You get so focused on what these celebrities are doing because it feels so otherworldly, but the reality is what's actually happening in the communities, and particularly in regional areas, particularly in an area like Northern Territory. I imagine there's some specific challenges that do require help. And if you're focusing too much on, oh, what's happening with these people that it doesn't really impact people who aren't that wealthy, it's just almost a distraction.
Yeah. I found when I started as a financial counselor, I'd sit in a cafe with friends and say, you know what, I've decided that most of what we see in the world is actually a facade. And I would say, do you know, I think that at least a third of the people sitting in this cafe probably can't actually afford to be sitting here. But they're here because that's the sort of the social norm. It's you want to meet with your friends. Well, let's go to the cafe and have lunch. It's not let's go for a walk on the beach. Well, it might be, but the majority of things are about sorry, appearances, keeping up appearances, about, we live in a world of influences and what we think we should be doing. But I think the reality for most people is nothing like that. Yeah.
And I think it's
Which
really
doesn't sound hopeful, I'm sorry, but there is hope. I just want to say that.
that's a good transition to my next point, which is one of the areas for our conversation today is the United Nations celebrates the International Day of Hope each year. So we're doing a couple of webinars as part of this International Day, and this is dedicated to promoting hope, well-being, and mutual respect as guiding principles for individuals and communities navigating global challenges. How do you feel this resonates with your work? You've spoken about sort of the challenges, but how does hope, form, and how do you think about hope with your work?
Yeah, so as financial counselors, it's our job to work with people to help them find options to address the situation they're in, options to find a way forward. And I often say I really enjoy the very first session I have with someone, because for me, that's a chance for them just to talk. And I find that if you give someone a safe space to share their story, to feel heard, to feel respected, that actually most people have the tools to find their own way forward. Um, they just haven't had the opportunity or the encouragement to do that. So I think that there is a lot of hope in just people actually being able to share their own stories and find their own path forward.
I love that. And that's so important. And it sounds so simple, but there's the dignity element there, and also just listening to people. And often it's kind of like when you've got a big to-do list and then you break things down and you kind of pick one thing to tick off the list. Having that conversation with you is a first step. And it's kind of for people to even organize the meeting or turn up to the meeting, it's like, oh, wait, actually, I've taken a step and now I'm talking to someone. So I can just see how that makes such a big difference when people are then articulating, oh, I'm struggling with A, B, and C, and then maybe they go, actually, maybe this feels achievable as I'm talking about it. It's kind of like when you
Absolutely. Yeah.
talk about it and then you think, actually, maybe that's not so bad. And I'm sure some people have very challenging circumstances, but I like the idea that for some people it's, just that taking that first step can be really impactful and have quite a profoundly positive impact.
Yeah, I would say for most people, just the opportunity to actually share. A lot of people, because of the sort of the stigma and the shame around money, we often say, oh, if only that person had come 6 months earlier. And people say that to us, oh, I wish I'd come earlier. I feel so much better now. And really, that's before we do any work at all. That's really just being able to share the anxiety and the fears that they've had, and just relieve some of that pressure. So yeah, yes, I often see kind of hope raised in the job and the work that we do. Yeah.
That's great. And I think that's just highlights how important your work is as well. And I think people realizing that, oh, if I just had this conversation 6 months ago, this could have alleviated a lot of stress. And Venetia and I talk a lot about the impact of financial stress on physical, mental health. There's so much tied in with financial stress and how that can then show up in other areas, relationships, health, etc. And it'd be great to know from what you've seen, how you feel Australia is currently faring in terms of giving hope to people who need it. And that's thinking about, financial, but also physical and mental health, how that's looked after. What are your thoughts based on what you've seen and learned?
Mm, It's a bit of a difficult question, that one. I think if we look at, recent surveys, I think it's not really a debate. I think it's probably fact that hope is probably at an all-time low at the moment for Australians. But I also think that's probably not a particularly Australian sentiment. It's probably global. Um, and I think that I would go back to sort of the thought that we're not encouraged to talk about money, or we're not trained to sort of think about money. And I think equally we're not really encouraged to share our, "Oh, I'm not doing very well at the moment, my mental health is suffering." And I think many of the people that we see at the moment actually have mental health tied into their financial challenges, and whether that's because the financial challenges have impacted mental health, or vice versa, and not just mental health, physical health as well. It's hard. It's both are happening. So I do think that probably not enough. There's not enough resources or attention being paid to actually the impacts of global circumstances at the moment.
Yeah, it's a fair point as well that globally there's quite a shift in sentiment. It's an interesting and challenging climate, I think, in the last 6 years, especially where there's so much change in a short amount of time, so many different pressures, global uncertainty, political uncertainty, and then that flowing through to Australia. But I think what you said really underpins a lot of it from the financial perspective, which is this stigma and shame around money. I think people, like you said, they're encouraged to put up a brave face, especially I think in Australia, there's this mentality of, just, pull your socks up and get on with it and she'll be right. But it's, I think, challenging when things aren't okay and then things can get worse and worse. And like you mentioned, if someone says, well, if I had just seen you 6 months ago, that would have made things so much easier. But why is it so challenging for them to have organized that 6 months ago? Well, potentially because of some of the pressures to just get on with it. So I think that's a really interesting point, and it does seem quite challenging to address that.
I think too that, we live in an increasingly complex world. We live in a really busy world. It's like, oh, well, I probably should go and get help, but hey, I've got to get the kids to sport, and then I've got to get work the 3 jobs, and I've got to kind of do this, that, and the other. We're in a hurry, things are complex. And even my colleagues, financial counselors, have been working for many years, are saying that the cases they're seeing now are becoming increasingly complex. And one of the greatest pieces of advice I was given when I started as a financial counsellor was, "Fiona, slow things down. People did not get in this situation overnight. They're unlikely to get out of this situation overnight." And I think that we are constantly looking for a silver bullet to fit into our busy lives, let's solve that problem and move on, and whatever. And I don't think it exists. And yeah, so I think maybe that's something else as financial counselors, is we give people actually the time and space to deal with what they need to deal with. We can help by removing some of the pressures, by slowing down creditors, or just to give people space. And I think generally speaking, people don't have that in their lives, and I think that creates more problems.
Absolutely, and especially if it's then difficult to recognize that things have gotten too hard, or there's too much, and you have that escalation of potentially health challenges or things changing where it can probably feel a lot worse, when there might be some easy steps to, well, not easy, but some things that could make it a little easier. And that actually is, you mentioned, some of the things you can do are help by removing pressures. Can you talk us through a little bit more about what financial counselors do and kind of what you're able to do to help people as well?
Yeah. So first and foremost, I'd like to say we are not financial advisors. Financial advisors do work with people who have money to invest. But having said that, I find myself having conversations with people when I say that I'm a financial counselor. there is an immediate assumption that I work with a particular socioeconomic group, i.e., the poor, however you want to envisage that. And so the first thing I want to say is that people in need, people who have financial challenges or in financial strife, come from every sector of the community. We work with people who have $1 million assets. We work with people who have high-paying jobs. But life has come along and done what life does, pull the rug out from people, or we're human, we make good and bad decisions. Sometimes those bad decisions will lead you to a financial counselor. So I just want to, I suppose, firstly be clear about that. We work with everyone, really. What we can do. So we work in different ways. So firstly, financial counselling is free. It will always be free. In fact, my ability to practice as a financial counsellor means my services must be free. We do everything from, it's funny, I always sort of forget all the things we do when I'm asked, what do you do? So we can help with creditors, we can negotiate with creditors, talk to creditors, we can help with things like bankruptcy, if that's where you end up. We can help you with the simple or the basics, the budgeting, or looking at your money, your own money story, making plans. We can help you access other services. So you might need housing services or health services or legal services. So we can help you sort of unpick your situation and find the services you're after. We can help you access the sorts of things that you're entitled to. So maybe if you're coming from domestic violence, there are certain things, entitlements that we can help you access that you might not know about. Things like concessions, we can help you navigate superannuation and tax and all of those sorts of things. So really, we take a holistic look at someone's life, and then we either step in and help, or having said we step in and help, we also work very hard to give people agency. So if someone is very capable, and I guess that's what I was talking about earlier, if someone is very capable, we don't take that away from them. Oh, don't worry, you just hand over all your problems to us, we'll fix them. We actually work with them to actually resolve their own challenges, strengthen their knowledge and their resilience, if you like, and get them back on the road. So really, I think the ultimate goal of a financial counsellor is to put ourselves out of work.
I love that, especially when there's, the goal is to not see someone ever again. It's in a positive way, that the best thing is to give them the independence, the skills, the confidence, and even, you have that first meeting, they just feel a little bit more able to handle the challenges because they've articulated them. I think that's so powerful. And it sounds like there's a lot of different things people may need help with, whether it's a more complex financial situation, or, something really simple like potentially working out their money that's coming in versus going out, some stuff that you could probably resolve fairly quickly versus others that would be quite complex and challenging circumstances to navigate. But I really like your point that it's not just for a certain segment of the population. I think that's something that people underestimate, is that regardless of your income, you can be in a challenging financial situation. Financial well-being isn't just about, oh, this certain cohort can have it. Same with financial literacy and resilience. You can have any sort of background, experience, income, savings, credit, and you could be equally in the situation as someone with a very different background and circumstance. So I really like that point that you made, because I think it's easy to just make assumptions about who needs these services and why. I think there's a big blame game that people like to play as well with
Very much.
being.
Yeah, and I really like, we can, on paper, we can see 3 people for exactly the same thing, and all 3 people will be completely different because of who they are, what their life experience is, the decisions that they want to make. Yeah. So, and that's what makes the job really interesting, I think. So it's about the human behind the money.
Absolutely. And then I think recognizing that it is an individual with their own skills and personality and confidence and challenges must make it quite rewarding, because it's not just here's the one solution that fits. And that's the complex thing, I think, with financial well-being and resilience as well, is that there isn't one solution because everyone's so different. You start adding the cultural element. There's lots of reasons why people would or wouldn't feel comfortable talking about money, or why financial circumstances are what they are. But yeah, it sounds like
Yeah.
something that would be quite rewarding.
Yeah, yeah, it really is. And I work with highly educated people who are terrible managing their money, and people who have some really basic education who are actually, when given half a chance, really very good at managing their money and just really need the confidence to understand that what they're making good decisions. So yeah, it is very interesting. And when I say that I started my career in the arts, never underestimate the power of creative thinking. So and I draw on that very heavily in this job. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's something that's always good to consider, especially, creativity isn't necessarily just art. It's something that can flow through to anything, creative thinking with a corporate job when you're looking at numbers. There's some things that I guess can be black and white, but there's, I think, lots of creative ways people can approach things. Even I think with problem solving, it's like if you tried to prescribe someone a solution for two people, it may not work in the same way. Someone might go, I'm really practical. I need to write this down. I need to have it in a spreadsheet. Someone else might go, I kind of need to draw some boxes and color and, do something really visual. And I'm sure you're very good at recognizing that people need different elements, and potentially your background in the arts has maybe really helped that.
Yeah, yeah, and I often say to people, look, you'll know yourself far better than I ever will. It's really, you could look at someone's budget and say, oh, they're spending a fortune on cigarettes. So it's very easy for me. I don't smoke. Give up smoking, and your whole financial situation will be better. But for someone that is a pack a day smoker, and that is their only outlet, perhaps the only way they keep their mental health together and whatever, it's really a pointless tip or a piece of advice for me to give. So we don't, as financial counselors, we don't start from that point. We start from, I mean, we talk about counseling, client centric practice, and that is definitely why. Yeah.
I think that's so good to just recognize and I think respect people's autonomy and give them dignity with, here's what I'm spending my money on. I'm not going to tell you that you should or shouldn't do that, but how can we make this a little bit easier? Because otherwise, I'm sure you'd lose people straight away. They go, hey, I'm ready for my appointment. And then you say, why are you spending your money on this? And they say, okay, I'll never talk to you again. So,
Exactly. Fantastic. I've come here, you've judged me, you've told me to do things that I'm never going to do, you've not listened to me. Great experience.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
No, I
So,
think it's so important.
yeah.
And what do you think are some practical solutions that could make the biggest impact? You've spoken about the value of that conversation, even just starting that first step. But what do you think is needed to improve health and well-being and financial well-being as well in communities?
Yeah. Okay. So I guess I have two thoughts on that. From a financial perspective, I think I just go back to where I started. Education. For me, knowledge is power. Education and also open and honest conversations about money. Let's get rid of the stigma. Let's get rid of the shame. Let's be real about money and its impacts on our lives. And if we can start having those sort of free and open conversations, then I think people will be able to get advice. I mean, we all carry good tips, good advice. We've all have some useful things, hacks, if you like, with money. If we just shared those, or if we were honest enough to say, "Oh my God, I've had this thing happen. Have you got any thoughts?" I reckon actually most people would find in their own friendship circle or family group some advice that could be quite useful and helpful. And even if it's not found at that level, at least you've got support. And I think a lot of people end up feeling very isolated around money. They don't want to talk about it, and that is when your mental health or your health starts to be impacted, where your well-being declines. So I think education first, just let's have some basic tools around money, and changing the situation about openly talking about money. But then I also think that communities helping each other and talking to each other, I think is a very strong solution as well. Yeah.
And so much of this does come down to the openness, open conversations, collaboration, and I think the more people are speaking openly, they can also, the more people communicate about money, I think hopefully would mean they're less receptive to things like scams or just advice that maybe is not necessarily appropriate for them. Someone says, "Oh, this is what I did. This is great. It's going to work for you," and then people kind of going, "Well, I've heard a lot of different things because we're talking more about money more openly. Therefore, I can go, I'm going to take a bit of that. I might take a bit of this and I might ignore that," rather than no one talks about it at all. So the first time you hear something, perhaps it does feel more concrete. And then potentially, if it doesn't work, you then feel like, "Oh, I can't even do this thing." But in reality, it wasn't the right solution.
Yeah, yeah. And we often do have people, scams is an interesting area. We often have people coming to us that because they've been so desperate and they've been too shy to talk about it, what they've done is what we all do, we Google. And up pops whoever's paid the most to get to the top of the list, and suddenly you're talking to some shonky dealer, and it's terrible. It's actually heartbreaking that these people or scammers or whatever usually prey on the people who do not have the money. So you see people's bad situations go to worse situations. So I think, yeah, I guess I'd like to talk a bit more about the community side of things. I suppose I sort of summed it up quite quickly there. I feel I choose to live in the Northern Territory and actually live in a small community in the Northern Territory, because to me it's a proper community. I live in a place where people, if you don't know each other's names, we certainly know each other by sight. We say hello to each other. You see someone walking along the street, you stop and ask if they need a lift. If someone is sick, people drop in with food or basic groceries. If you know someone is struggling or alone, they're invited round for, you invite them round for a cuppa or a meal or something like that. And while that all sounds very sort of wholesome, it probably is. And I think in many ways this community pulls together. We're like a big family. We don't always get along, but we actually help each other out. And I think at that level, it provides well-being in a more holistic sort of way. And I don't necessarily know the intimate details of everybody that lives here. I don't need to know the intimate details, but I do know the ebb and flow of the community. And I know if someone's having a hard time, I know I can help them out. And if someone's having a good time, I can go and celebrate with them. So yeah, and I think that to me, when I know there are definitely parts of this world, many parts of this world, where people can't even name their neighbour, I think if we can get back to actually just helping each other at a grassroots level, then everybody's well-being would lift. And I'm sorry if that sounds like a utopian society, but that's my belief. Yeah.
That's great. And especially the isolation you've mentioned a couple of times when it comes to financial challenges. And when someone feels isolated, it can then lead to other challenges. And then potentially they're more vulnerable as well to scams or to solutions that aren't right for them because there's no sounding board and people not checking in on each other. So I love that idea and I can see why that's so important. And I think the more people feel like they're not isolated, the more conducive it can be for actually recognizing, "Oh, I'm not doing too well. I'm always talking, there's someone always around to talk to so I can bring it up," rather than not even necessarily knowing who the first person could even be to bring this up with. So I think sounds really important on a number of levels as well. And my final question is around when we think about some of the themes we've spoken about with financial well-being, but then also, health and physical health, mental health, who do you think has the greatest role to play in providing these solutions? Is it governments, businesses, nonprofits, community leaders? Is it ourselves? Is it each other? What do you think would make a difference and who could play a big role?
I actually think it's all the parts playing together. So I said the word holistic before, and I do believe in holistic solutions. I think, we're only as, what's that saying? You're only as strong as your weakest part. So I think, politicians creating good policy based on sound research. I think ethical business practices, and I think simply inviting your neighbour around for a cup of tea and a chat. So I think on every level, the solution is right across all levels of society. We all have our strengths and weaknesses. If we play to our strengths, then we can only really, in my mind, serve to go forward. So once again, I understand it's a bit utopian, but I also think we live in a world where it's very easy to sit on the sidelines and snipe. Oh, that person's not doing a good job. Oh, what a terrible, but not willing to step up ourselves. Um, and I do, if I take my own my personal sort of reasoning behind why I do what I do. I've stopped watching the news because I used to be a news junkie. I'd watch it all day, every day. Um, and I found myself becoming depressed. And I just realized there was nothing I could do about these global events. Like, what impact can I have? So I decided to turn off the news and actually just start at my own doorstep. If I can have a positive impact on my local community, then actually that's good. And I feel positive about that. I feel good about that. And I think if everybody did that, then actually, then we end up with a better world. Um, I do understand global conflict and whatever is still going to continue, but at least right here, right now, I'm doing what I can. So that's the best I can do.
I think that's great. And I think it's easy for everyone to say none of us can make a difference, but even just the individual, I think there's a lot that could be said for someone's legacy being that they were just a really nice person to be around, and the value of when you're going for a walk and you're kind of saying hello to people, and it's not just everyone's in their own world, because the isolation point you mentioned, that just gets worse and worse the more everyone's by themselves, because then it feels harder to do that organically. It feels harder to help each other, but it also feels harder to ask for help. So I think there's so many elements there that fit really well together when you're just thinking about, well, maybe I can't change the global political landscape, but what can I do in my local community? How can I help my neighbor? And it sounds like, your work is definitely making an impact. I think there's lots of ways that you're helping people in really meaningful ways, but also it sounds like the way that you engage with community is also making a big difference. And I think that's such a nice message for us to think about and for us to conclude our discussion today as well. And I'll hand back to Vineeta to share some final
Could I
thoughts.
just,
Oh,
sorry,
please.
can I just quickly, what I'd like to say is that there are lots of people out there with big hearts who are working for their communities, not for recognition, not for the big bucks. They do it because they feel passionate about it. And that is what we should feel hopeful about. Yeah.
Absolutely love that and completely agree. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. You have summed up in, the short sentences that you've given us in terms of one-liners, exactly what Anna and myself and a whole lot of others have been working on for decades. So I really thank you for, the pearls of wisdom that you've shared with us today. You've talked about the stigma and the shame that people feel about not being able to manage money well. Whereas the reality is that basic financial literacy is only just being put into some curriculum. We're not being taught this as a basic thing that everyone should know about. Yet the financial world around us is becoming more and more complex, with the products being so complex that even an ex-banker like myself sometimes struggles to understand them. So how do we expect people who haven't had the education or the experience to do that? You're absolutely spot on. And one of the key things that Anna and myself work on very hard is this holistic concept that you've talked about, a user-centered, personalized approach, no matter what it is you're offering. And this is so relevant to my own experience as well. As you know, I moved from the financial world into the mental health world because of the learning that you've had. that money and worries about money and mental health are so closely linked to each other, yet not everyone is working in that space to talk about the importance of it. So that's the little niche that we feel that we can add value to. I love the fact that you've said that financial literacy is not just linked to a low income, the poor. Absolutely right. Financial capability, you could be the richest person yet not have the capability to make good decisions and wise decisions. I love the fact that you've pointed out that you've switched off the news because it makes you depressed. And what you're choosing to do is to go outside your door and do what you can in your local community. And may I tell you, from the point of psychological knowledge, that is the most powerful thing that you can do. Have the locus of control, looking at things that you can control rather than worrying about things which are outside your control.
Yeah.
And you've hit the nail on the head in terms of social connection. The strongest indicator of healthy aging is social connections. So, Fiona, you are on the money with all of the years of financial education that you've had. I can tell you from the point of view of psychological education that the conclusions that you have reached are exactly the ones that psychology would also look at. The most important thing that we can do is give people a safe space so that they are heard. And once they are, they can have their own agency and make their own decisions, and then hopefully have a more sustainable way of managing their health and well-being themselves. So like you, psychologists also do themselves out of a job. That's the role of a psychologist, is to not have ongoing contact with their clients. So I take this opportunity to thank you once again, Fiona. Everything that you've talked about is exactly what the International Day of Hope is about. And I hope that your journey can inspire others to do what they can do rather than wait for others to solve the problems they see around them. So thanks once again, Anna and Fiona, for your wonderful words of wisdom.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.